Thank you. Thank you, Lolly. Thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it. This is my first time in Kansas City, so thanks for putting me up, and thanks for the barbecue. And I look forward to the next time. Before I forget, if you do me a favor, like I have my phone, but if you could give me like a wave when we're at 15 minutes, just so I don't get away from myself. Full disclosure, I generally speak for 80 minutes. Right, so that's lecture time. So I just wanted to make sure that I don't keep you from all the other meetings that you have. So today I'm pretty much going to be talking about promoting diversity in real life, IRL, taking lessons out of the office, out of the classroom. It's very exciting to hear that you guys have explicitly diversity initiatives, regular speakers who come in talking about these issues. So I apologize if anything seems kind of beginner, so I've tried to clean those up as much as I can, but also I'd like to make sure that we are kind of all on the same page regarding key terms, language, and what diversity actually means when we talk about taking it outside of the learning space. So before we begin, I asked you just to think about, and you don't have to share, how you complete the phrase I am blank. Fun fact, this is a pretty standard psychology manipulation to encourage people to start thinking about themselves. Generally speaking, most people answer, actually before we get to that, out of curiosity, for those of you who did it, about how many terms did you generate? How many of you had between, let's say, 5 and 7 terms? Okay, so a good chunk, about a third. How many of you had about 7 to 12? All right. How many of you had 12 to 20? Okay, so we pretty much kind of hit the cap. Full disclosure, like I said, most people usually are about 7 to 10. And when we start to look at the trends and how we identify, there's also explicit patterns in that space as well. I encourage you to stop and think, what categories did you generate, right? Did you mention your race? Did you mention your gender? Did you mention your nationality? How many people mentioned their nationality? I am American. Or not American, whatever the case may be, excuse me. All right, so we have like 2 people who mentioned that. For those of you who did, if you don't mind me asking, what nationality are you?
American.
American? And did you also do?
I did.
And you?
It was ethnicity, Afro-Dominican.
Okay, Afro-Dominican. So this makes a really interesting point. For the most part, the room did not identify their nationality, and that demonstrates a trend. We tend to identify with the things that differentiate us, right? I'm going to make the assumption that the majority of the folks in this room are American citizens. We are sitting in a state in the United States, right? That is a very normal identity. Right, it's common, it's almost expected to some degree. So we don't generally identify with that. Thank you for identifying. Having said that, we can also take the example, right, Afro-Dominican, that's something, I assume, sets you apart in most conversations. And understanding how we identify and our own individual processes are essential to understanding how we see and how we define diversity. Religion, how many people identify with their religion? 1, right? So again, these are topics that we don't generally think of. How many of you identified with your race, if you don't mind? Okay, more, like 3 or 4. How many of you identified with your gender, whatever your gender may be? Okay, so a few more. How many of you identified with your socioeconomic status? 1. Okay, so again, the reason I bring up these numbers is because I want you to see that when we think about diversity, we often jump to issues of race and gender for the most part, right? But diversity is much more complicated and involves a mix of things, right? So we can have diversity on any one dimension and homogeneity on another dimension. So I want you to be thinking about that. And how you define diversity as it relates to you and as it relates to the people you spend time with. On the same token, these are ascribed categories for the most part. We can talk about how religion is definitely an achieved category, right? But for a lot of people, religion comes as part of their family upbringing, and maybe you come to it later in life. Class, socioeconomic status in the United States, we definitely like to think about that as an achievement, but much of the statistics demonstrates that the class or socioeconomic status you are born into has a significant impact regardless of your efforts. But the first ones are generally ascribed categories. Those are categories that people put onto you. And you come to identify with them often as they determine your engagements with other people. Alternatively, I encourage you to think how many of you identified with achieved categories. So how many of you wrote your occupation? Okay. So about half the room. Your interpersonal relationships, that is to say, I'm a wife, I'm a husband, I'm a mother, I'm a friend, I'm a father, whatever the case may be. Something that relates you to other people, almost everyone. And we can talk about, again, how these personal identifiers are very much essential to our understanding of ourselves and thereby the way we see the world. And finally, how many of you identified with your personality? I am outgoing, I am vivacious, I am quiet, right? So about half. And each of these things are things that we come to. They're things that we achieve. We may have some ascribed component, right? So we talk about how personality doesn't necessarily change over time, but they're different. They're not necessarily things that people have ascribed to you. And what's most important, as I already said, we categorize ourselves with salient or unique categories, the things that differentiate us. Having said that, we are also non-salient and non-unique categories. So just because one category does not stand out doesn't necessarily mean that it's not there. One that I didn't put up here is sexuality, right? So when we stop to think about, I will open the question. Again, you're always welcome to raise your hand or not raise your hand. Did anybody identify with their sexuality? So nobody raised their hand. And that's your choice, whether or not you identify, whether or not you want to share. But for the most part, we don't. For those who are heterosexual, do not generally identify with their heterosexuality, right? Whereas for marginalized or stigmatized groups, we see that they are more likely to write these things down in this open space. It's also important to note that we are the intersection of all of these categories. So at any given time, you are not just a woman, you are not just a man, you are not just a lawyer, you are not just your race, you are not just your religion. You are all of these things at once, and that intersectionality is also essential to the definition of diversity and our understanding and perceptions thereof. So just a little information on myself. My name is Charisse Laprie Corsby Masse. I was born with all four names. I'll save that one for later. I was going to say, everyone always asks, oh, did you get married? Because in high school I went by Charisse Masse. No, I didn't get married. Actually, yes, I did, but that's beside the point. I got married like a month and a half ago, but it's fine. So my joke no longer works. No, it's all right. I grew up in White Plains, New York, so that's just outside the Bronx. I went to undergrad in Boston and studied brain and cognitive science and comparative media studies at MIT. I did grad school in Los Angeles. I have a master's from the film school in critical studies in film and television and a PhD from the psych department, specifically in social psychology. And I currently live in Syracuse, New York. Each of these cities are also part of my identity. For me, I was always a New Yorker in Boston, I was a New Yorker in LA. There's great city rivalries. My family is also out of Guyana, so I identify as West Indian. And as someone who appears ethnically ambiguous, I often get people ask, what are you? I always hate that question, but when I choose to answer, I will say Guyana. I will say Guyanese. Fun fact, people who introduce themselves with that question or start off our conversations with that question often don't know that Guyana is a country. So that's a shame. And I've gotten a lot of really, really problematic responses. My favorite one is, wow, you're awfully light-skinned for an African. And we're done with this conversation. Right? Having said that, both of my parents are out of Guyana. My entire family is out of Guyana, Trinidad, Jamaica, British West Indies. So ethnically, I identify as Caribbean, as West Indian, 100%. I was born in the US, but I was the first person in my family, in my direct lineage, to be born here. So that's also a key component of my identity, and I have an area of research looking at how how Caribbeans talk about race and how that impacts multi-ethnic and multiracial Caribbeans in their ethnic identity. It's a fun one. My research question, which is a big component of my identity, because it's pretty much how I've spent the past 20 years, is trying to answer how do media impact the way we think about ourselves and others? And more importantly, how do we use media to affect our identity and self-concept? So in all your free time, I encourage you to check out my TEDx talk on the psychology of selfies, looking at how and why we take selfies and why we share them and what that means for our own identity. As I said, I've been working through these questions for a really long time. I also identify as an only child. Don't tell my brothers. I came to get to know my father's kids when I was like 15 and 20, so I was definitely raised as my mother's only child. I identify as an only child, but again, that identity is different from categories, especially as our categories change over time. So just to share some of my categories with you, I identify as a cis woman. I identify as multiracial. I identify as first-generation American, a researcher, and a teacher. And these are each individual categories, but then again, intersectionality is important. So what does it mean when I identify as a multiracial first-generation American, a cis woman researcher, etc., or a multiracial researcher? I don't know if you can actually see those little transitions, but that each of these intersections informs my experiences and the lens through which I see the world differently. And I encourage you to start connecting between your different categories and ask yourself, how does this category appear, impact the way I engage with other people in talking about my understanding and their understanding of the world? Here's another identity. Did anybody put their political affiliation down? Okay, so we've got a couple of those. In our current public discourse, we're seeing more active identification with that space, thereby demonstrating how, thereby demonstrating how public discourse, what matters in the public sphere, impacts whether or not we identify with these different categories. And then there's all these other categories, right? So Caribbean, artist, New Yorker, daughter, wife. My husband's very excited when I put this up here. He's like, you identify as a wife now. I'm like, I put it on the board. That doesn't mean that I identify. And cat lady, right? So I have 2 cats, and they are the joy of my life. That's not my husband. And just, so yeah, that's how I identify. All of these things exist at once. And I encourage you to ask yourself, as I ask myself every day, how do these characteristics, categories, groups, and identities impact what we see? And I'll make a point to say I just want to differentiate between these terms because we tend to conflate them and use them synonymously. A characteristic is something some artifact that you have, whatever it is, right? We can say vests or suits or necklace, right? It's a characteristic. Sometimes we begin to categorize people by that. Generally, we don't categorize people by whether or not they're wearing vests or a necklace, unless the circumstances call for it. Then we begin to aggregate people into certain groups given their categories. These categories, I apologize, I shouldn't have used the word group there. We aggregate people into categories, right? These categories become groups when they have a common goal, right? So just because you have a bunch of people wearing a vest, you might categorize them if we're looking at clothing, but until these vest people have a common goal, they have not necessarily become a group. And a group becomes an identity when it becomes important to you personally, right? So you guys can think of characteristics that are not categories, categories to which you belong that are not groups, and groups to which you don't identify with, right? So I just want to stop and think about that as well, because when we think about when we think about diversity, we often think about characteristics. And this can be different from understanding someone's actual identity, right? So knowing that these are different levels of discourse, different levels of conversation, different levels within each individual person, is essential to our ability to talk about these things. Because you are X, I cannot assume that that is important to you. Not even that you are X, but because you have X characteristic, I cannot assume that that is important to you. So just a couple of questions to think about it, right? It's a happy little GIF, happy little GIF of a child winning at a board game. I'll make a point to say this is the first time I ever had like a media literate thought as a child. I watched a lot of TV, as a child. And I watched a lot of commercials. I was always fascinated by commercials. And I realized in like 5th grade or so that in the board game commercials, they had all these diverse kids. They were like kids of different races, there were boys, there were girls, everyone was playing together. It was like the Benetton ad of commercials, which is actually just another commercial, but it's fine, right? They were so diverse. But it was always the little boy who jumped up and said, "I won!" Every time. I started taking notes on it, and I went into class, and I got real angry. And I'm like, are they saying that girls can't win? Are they saying that we have to let the boys win? This is bull. I was 5 years old, I'm sure. Excuse me, I was in 5th grade. I'm sure I didn't cuss. But either way, when we start to see these patterns, it might be very easy. Obviously, at 5th grade, I also didn't know the word sexist for the most part, right? So I didn't see it as sexist. I didn't really understand that that was a thing, but I knew it was a problem, right? So then I ask you, is this sexist? And when we say something is sexist, what does that actually mean? I'll make this point that when we say something is sexist, that means 20 different things to 20 different people. And part of not having that shared language is part of our inability to talk about things. Now, in the office, in the classroom, you guys have a forced shared language for the most part, right? There's the language that you use around the office, but by coming to these conversations, by having these diversity conversations over and over, you guys generate a shared vocabulary that is not necessarily happening outside of this office or outside of this space. So understanding what other people think the word sexist means is essential to being able to describe why something is or is not sexist. Well, more importantly, I would encourage you just to get rid of the word sexist as a whole, right? To talk about what the problem is, not necessarily that it is this thing that we know to be bad. Guess what? Have you guys seen this ad before? I assume it's a classic one, right? Is this racist? I ask my students this all the time, like, is this racist? And they all just, they think it's a trick question because they're like, it's probably racist. Professor McCree is her whole thing. It's probably racist. But there's always a couple of hands that come up and they're like, yeah, it's kind of grabbing on her and kind of looks like kind of animalistic. I know that's racy, right? Like, they're trying, but it's not cliche, right? It's not obvious in why this is racist. Having said that, when this magazine went to supermarket shelves, in 2006, everyone was like, this is racist. How could you do this? Then I asked them, is it racist now, right? And it's beautiful. You see all these 18-year-olds and their jaws drop and their eyes get wide and they're like, oh yeah, no, that's definitely racist now, right? And it's not racist because, LeBron is clutching Gisele Bundchen. We can talk about a racialized history of interracial relationships and how race has been the the safety of white women have been used to stoke fear of black men. Like, there is a long history to which we come to this image. But just seeing the historical pattern, I guess this is 1916, so 90 years later, right? We see it. It's racist because it perpetuates a racially problematic history. That's why it's racist, right? It's not racist because, it could be racist for 100 other reasons as well. But to say, it's racist because it makes him look bad, well, clearly Annie Leibovitz and Anna Wintour said it makes him look good. Otherwise, why would they put this picture on the cover, right? It's racist because it's offensive. Well, LeBron James has said it's not offensive. So how is that an argument, right? it's racially problematic because it perpetuates an image of black men as animals, and again, white women as having to be protected from said animals. And we have this conversation every time there's a King Kong movie, right? Although if you saw the last King Kong movie, I really enjoyed that one. The one with Samuel L. Jackson, where they go to Kong's land and Kong becomes the character that you're rooting for. I thought it was cool. So in this seemingly simplistic yet complex conversation, how do we convey these things to others? How do we describe what is problematic and thereby changing the conversation not only in our interpersonal relationships, but also in the grander public discourse, right? Public discourse doesn't exist as this thing that none of us impact. Each of us have an impact on it every single day. So the 6 steps that I kind of want to take you through today are these 6. Sorry, I was prepared for speed online. These 6. I'm not going to read through them because we'll go through them step by step, but it's certain things to think about as you engage with others. I'm also a big fan, I hate cognitive neural modeling. I find it very overwhelming because it's a lot of structural equation modeling and I get lost in it. But the image, I think, is really important because it demonstrates how we think about different constructs. How we think about constructs and how these constructs are associated in our minds, right? So that is to say that there is some input. There is something that we are getting, some stimuli, be it an image, be it someone's category or characteristic, be it a word, right? Each of these things, we're getting an input. There's some association in our brain where that input means something, right? So if I say table, you guys say, I heard one, chairs. I was hoping for, okay, tables. There we go, right? Because we have this association between tables and chairs. We don't have that association because that's just natural, right? We have an association between tables and chairs because we see tables with chairs over and over and over and over again. And that builds up a correlation between these different constructs. So that's this hidden layer. Then, as we see, let me start over, excuse me. We have the input as stimuli, we have a hidden layer, and then those connections result in some kind of output. That output may be an attitude, it may be language, it may be an action, it may be behavior we choose, right? We move through the world by processing the infinite amount of stimuli we consume every minute of every day, and generally rely on our brain to have figured it out without much cognitive effort. Having said that, we do this with people. And when we allow ourselves to do this, or when we don't disrupt this process, then we allow ourselves to contribute to problematic discourse, problematic discrimination, problematic disparities, etc. So the goal of today is to go through just some ways to think about these things and ways to talk about these things with other folks who have not necessarily sat through these lectures, taken these classes, etc. So the first thing to remember is that what influences you also influences others. And I mean that in the most objective of ways. That is to say, your individual characteristics, your own identities that you listed, also other people's individual identities also impact them. So by understanding how your individual characteristics and your experiences by understanding how your individual characteristics and your individual experiences impact the decisions that you make, we need to provide that same understanding, same empathetic processing to other people. So this is Bronfenbrenner's 1977 ecological systems model. Bronfenbrenner is a developmental psychologist. I wanted to go into developmental psychology, but the IRB for under 18s is a lot of work, so sorry, that's a psych joke. Don't worry about it. That's the kind of joke that people who identify with psychologists get. My bad. Anyway, under 18, I mean, you guys work with, you're familiar with the amount of work that goes into questioning minors, right? So So psychologists are like, you know what, we'll measure everybody over 18, and then we'll just make assumptions about people under 18. It's an inherent problem in our discipline. But this is the crux of developmental psychology according to Bronfenbrenner. That in the center of this ecological systems model, there's your individual characteristics, the things that you have been born with or are endemic to your personhood, independent of the rest of the world. For example, sex, age, to some degree health, right? Things that just exist in you, independent of everybody else. Then there's your interpersonal relationships, which he refers to for the most part as the microsystem, the people with whom you are having individual interactions with on a day-to-day basis or a functionally daily basis. This can be your family, your friends, within the school system, within your religious group. It's important to distinguish between religious group, right? So your church, the people you interact with in your religion, as opposed to the larger meta structure that is, your religious organization, the Catholic Church or what it may be. And as we already described, these interactions affect our identity, right? The friends that we have, our family's opinions, our family's identity, our school's identity, all of these impact how we think about ourselves, especially in relationship with others. So I encourage you, as you were thinking through your categories, is it possible for you to identify objectively, right? So when we say, I am a woman, that is an identity that you may have come to over time, right? And we can talk about gender as a performance and the extent to which we come to our understandings of our own gender independent of whatever our genetic chromosomes are. So I encourage you to think through those categories, see, which ones are completely objective, and is that even possible? I don't know, I think maybe curly hair might be an identity that I have that I'd like to believe is objective, but it's probably only curly when it's washed. So. Then we have these meta-social relationships, right? Government, cultural attitudes, these larger social structures that impact us as well as impact the individuals with whom we have interpersonal interactions. Technically, Bronfenbrenner puts mass media in this space. I'm not a fan of that, and I'll tell you why in a second, but before we get to that, I'll just draw attention to the chronosystem, right, which is how these relationships change over time. So if we were to cut through this model, like tree branches, right, tree trunks, we would see a different pattern over time, different things emerge. For me, though, mass media doesn't fit in any one of these. It's like the cinnamon on top of the cinnamon roll. I haven't eaten lunch yet. It's the cinnamon on top of the cinnamon roll. It impacts everybody at every level. It impacts you individually because you are watching, consuming media, engaging with media. It impacts you through your interpersonal relationships, your family, your friends. It impacts people in government who are then impacting you through their decision-making and policy, etc., right? So media is much more pervasive than simply fitting within this system. Having said that, as we think about engaging with other people, is to know that the media they are consuming may or may not be the media you are consuming. And the role of media in impacting our ability to talk to one another is generally referred to, or it's referred to as the difference between mainstreaming and polarization, right? So for the most part, when we lived in a 3-network system, plus PBS, when we lived in a 3-network system, everyone was watching one of 3 conversations, right? And therefore, we all had a shared understanding of what key issues were, what the key talking points were, etc. In my classes, I have all my students watch PBS NewsHour. That is where we are beginning. That is the information I need everyone to know. And that is how we are going to start these conversations. Not, oh, I read BuzzFeed, and I read Breitbart, and I read The Economist, right? Students don't read The Economist. But if we have these different conversations, we don't necessarily, it's harder for us to come together, right? So if we all have one shared, at least a shared source of information of reality, we can have different conversations. So understanding that what you're consuming impacts what you believe, think, say, engage with is essential to understanding that what other people are consuming impacts them. And the value that you put in the media you consume is just as important, is similar to the value someone else puts into the media they consume. Which brings us to shared language, right? Knowing what the terms are, knowing that when I say something, we have this agreed upon meaning. And especially when it comes to issues of diversity, inclusion, stereotypes, we often don't have that shared understanding. As I said, with the first examples on what is sexist and what is racist. So in the interest of time, I'll just go through these, but I encourage you to think about what these words mean to you. In fact, maybe we should just take the time to do it. Would anybody like to define what diversity means? Just off the top of your head. What does diversity mean? Nobody? And yes, here in the front.
I'll take a stab.
Please do. Tell me your name.
Curtis Moore.
Curtis Moore. Please. What does diversity mean?
I typically, when I see that word, I think of it as viewpoints other than my own.
Okay.
And that assumes a lot of things.
Okay, absolutely. So understanding that there's a mix, right? You bring one thing, and hopefully someone else will bring something else. That's a good one. That's a good one. Then let me put this question out there. Could somebody tell me what they've heard someone else thinks diversity means? This may involve some stereotypes, so that's okay. We'll put on our stereotype hat. Let's get judged. What have you heard diversity mean to other people? In the back, tell me your name.
Stephanie.
Stephanie.
Someone other than a white man.
Okay, yeah, so that they're, this just checking boxes, right? That we need to have this many black folks. Goal for diversity. In my opinion, I definitely argue, especially in systems, like institutional systems, there's definitely a goal. I would love to see parity, period. Having said that, our interpersonal discussions is very different. And I appreciate, I'm gonna go Curtis, right? Okay. Curtis's individual distinction that diversity comes from spending time with whom I am not, right? Or having a perspective different than mine. So I identify diversity as a heterogeneous mix. And it's important to remember, that this can be heterogeneous in one sense and homogeneous in another sense. So on what dimensions is your group diverse? And in what dimensions is it not? And this is an important thing to come from, right? Because Allport would say that the social contact hypothesis is the best way to change attitudes about different people. That is to say, just engaging with someone who is not you is a great way to expand your worldview. So as you engage with people who may or may not, let's go with may not. If you engage with people who do not believe what you believe or do not see the world the way you see the world, a big part of being able to engage with them is to see, well, where are we similar, right? It's important to note that homogeneity and commonality have a purpose. Where are we similar? Okay, now that we have that grounding, how can we talk about how we're different? When we talk about inclusion, I make the point to say that this is different than diversity, right? Diversity is a mix of things. Inclusion is promoting a space where differences are valued, right? That I hear you are different, and that doesn't mean weird, right? What can I learn from you for being different? One of my students was talking about interviewing a CEO, and she said that when making decisions about who gets hired, they're looking for someone who will fit into our office culture. And she's like, yeah, but you only have one woman. So what is your office culture, right? I don't think she said that actually to the CEO, but she was thinking it, and she said it out loud in my class, right? That when we're looking for people with a good fit, or what does that mean? And how is that word kind of used as a placeholder for avoiding terms like homogeneity or a homogeneous culture, right? Is less, you don't want someone who's going to pick fights with every single person in the office. I take that as given, right? We're not going to the opposite end. But if you agree that this is what's normal in our office and we only want people who will fit into this normal concept, or in our home, or in our family, or in our club, or whatever the case may be, then we are promoting homogeneity and avoiding inclusion, but without using such words. And this is why shared vocabulary is important, because if we can't see something, or excuse me, if we can't say something, we can't help other people to see something. When we talk about discourse, and I've used that word multiple times, generally speaking, my classes are specifically targeted towards disrupting discourse. Discourse are trends in the way things are discussed, pretty much asking the same questions and getting the same answers. It's a homogeneity of speech. It's a homogeneity of rhetoric. The example I often give is in the US, we're talking about whether or not climate change is happening, right? Well, if we're constantly in this conversation about whether or not climate change is happening, we can't really get to the point where we talk about, well, how do we act to stop these major climatological events that seem to be correlated with various exhausts and byproducts, of industrialization. And I saw a really great research project once on content analyses of news stories with related to climate change compared US, I think it was US, South Korea, and I feel a Western European nation, but I can't recall which it was. And the researcher found that in the US, the conversation was dominated by whether or not we are having this conversation, whether or not it exists. Everyone else was talking about and arguing about best ways to solve it, right? So if we can't get past this one question, then we can't ask every other question that thus impeding our ability to engage in discussions. And I encourage you to think about how this pattern manifests in the way you talk about diversity either in the office or outside of the office. And finally, I'll just make a quick point on stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, because like I said, I feel a little beginner. I think you guys know those, but in the interest of making sure we're all on the same page, I want to introduce the definitions here because for a lot of folks, these are synonymous. In the same way, we ask, well, is this racist? Is this sexist? Well, if we don't know the difference between stereotypes and prejudice and discrimination, then if you say a stereotype, then that means you're discriminating. In some cases that is true, in some cases that is not true. So just very briefly, stereotypes are cognitive associations between constructs, right? We talk about table, chair, it's not a stereotype, the stereotypes tend to deal with people, but it's a cognitive association. If I say A, you think B. And the fact that we apply those to people often makes sense for our brain, right? Because we can't spend the time processing the nuances of every single person we meet, or can we, right? I think that's a good place to try. Having said that, understanding that our brain is using these things as shorthand so that we don't have to put forth effort is essential to putting forth more effort. Alternatively, prejudices are defined as attitudes or opinions towards an object, right? So specifically, I like or I don't like this person, this group, this characteristic, this category, etc. That is different than the association. Having said that, have you guys taken the implicit association task, right? The buttons and the faces and the right. So that generally measures stereotypes. It measures how closely these things are connected. And I give that to my students and they get upset. They're like, oh, this study's telling me I'm racist. I'm like, no, I know what your responses are. I know what your answers are because we all have these associations because we've all grown up in this space and we've all had this data. The extent to which you are then making other judgments about other people because of it, now we're getting into issues of prejudice. And the extent to which you act upon those things, we're getting into issues of discrimination. Discrimination is explicitly behavior or actions towards an object. We have control over the latter two. We have less control over the first one, right? And being able to separate those is essential to how we talk to ourselves and to others. So in the interest of time, I'll just go through this, and I encourage you to think about different types of discrimination, especially as you try to call out or talk about these things with other people, right? We think about something being racist. For the most part, we jump to individual overt. one person says that I don't like this group, I will not have this group in my house, I will not have this group in my group, whatever the case may be, right? That's really where we jump to. So when we say, oh, such and such is racist, you might easily get the response, well, I'm not a member of the Klan, so I'm not a racist, right? That we take it to this extreme because we usually drift into individual, the actions of individuals, and overt, vocal hatred, vocal anger, vocal behaviors. However, the phenomenon around the game commercials, at no point would we ever say any of those children are racist. The CEOs or the people making those advertisements might not have seen that pattern, right? That's an example of institutional disparity. So when we say something is racist, or we say an institution or a law is racist, it's because it's having a disproportionate impact. And for the most part, it's having a disproportionate impact that perpetuates disproportionate impacts against a certain group, hence marginalization, stigmatization, and discrimination. Implicit discrimination are where we make assumptions about other people, kind of normalize it. And like I said, I won't show it, but there's a great clip in my interview with Larry Wilmore where I asked him, what does implicit racism look like in media industry? And he's like, the one that always irked me was the idea that black shows weren't as good as white shows, and that black writers weren't as good as white writers, right? And that's just this pervasive assumption. And he talks about being really proud that they won a Peabody for the Bernie Mac show, that it was a good show. It was definitely a black show. He was constantly battling this assumption that black writers weren't as good as white writers, and therefore black shows weren't as good as white shows. Aversive discrimination is how our pervasive expectations and social discriminatory actions jive with our rhetoric of egalitarianism, right? That we are the United States and everyone, all men are created equal. Ladies, we'll get to you later. All men are created equal. But at the same time, we see that that's not the case. If you were not landowning, if you were not Christian, specifically Protestant, if you were not white, right? If you were not a certain type of pilgrim from a very specific nation. I really got a great Family Guy quote up a little bit later that I really enjoyed. And then statistical discrimination is literally when we use statistics to make arguments that the thing is real, that this is actually a worthwhile, that this is a legitimate observation. So when we say, well, the majority of people in jail, the majority of criminals are black and brown people, therefore, stereotype hat here, please don't think I believe this, that, well, if there are more black folks in jail, then black folks must be inherently criminal. If there are fewer women in science, then women must be bad at science. And when the president of Harvard repeats that, it's particularly offensive, right? Because we don't stop to think, as Larry Summers, 2006, we don't stop to think how we got to this statistical discrimination. We're using statistics to rationalize our discriminatory attitudes instead of stopping to think of how we got here. So we'll keep going in the interest of time, but I encourage you to realize that discrimination hurts everyone. And this, I think, is a really important piece of the puzzle because we often talk about how discrimination hurts people who are being discriminated against. But I encourage you to realize that the people who are being advantaged by discrimination are still impacted in that they are. I had a fun conversation with students. They were like, well, I asked them, who benefits from impeding rights, right? And we watched or we listened to Martin Luther King and Selma talk about how poor whites were fed Jim Crow, right? This idea that interpersonal racism and the elevation of whiteness over blackness has allowed, or encouraged, let me rephrase that, have kept working class white folks and working class black folks from coming together to solve structural inequalities of class. Right? So clearly the people in power are managing to maintain power by keeping working classes, lower classes divided over something as arbitrary as racism. So even in this space where one group is advantaged over another, that group is still suffering because they are not seeing their own, they're encouraged not to see their own situation. So the question is, why end race and racism and discrimination if it means less power and privilege? And I'll just leave you with these numbers because when I heard this, it blew my mind, right? So we're in a space now where the population of white folks is decreasing, right? We hear that often. The population of people of color, specifically Latinos, right? Because black folks are holding steady about 13. Specifically Latinos and people of Asian descent are expanding. Having said that, especially among Latinos, their income is not rising, right? So in the math of it, if we have less people making more money and more people making less money, that's going to have a significant impact on our overall ability to generate wealth as a nation, right? If half of our population is not allowed to read, or excuse me, 13% of our population is not allowed to read, and half of our population aren't allowed to go to school, right? Women weren't allowed to go to college, have some sister schools, but for the most part, women weren't allowed to go to college till the late 1800s, early 1900s, right? Then we have limited our actual intellectual capacity as a nation. So it hurts everyone. Income inequality is affected by institutional sexism, racism, and homophobia, right? All of these things. So our ability to excel as a collective is impacted by discriminating against one component of said collective. As we're talking about this, I encourage you to emphasize facts over feelings. This is really essential. We often say, oh, that's offensive. My argument, actually maybe we'll get to that one, okay. Let's emphasize facts over feelings, right? Objective data is greater than subjective anecdotes. Impacts of discrimination are based in history, right? So can you argue or be racist against white folks? Again, that depends on what your definition of racism is. Can you be prejudiced against white folks? Can one person be prejudiced against someone else? Absolutely, regardless of their category. The extent to which that prejudice fits into historical, systemic discrimination and inequality is different, right? So it's just really important to understand the difference between individual overt racism or individual overt sexism and institutional disparities. So I'll just keep going, but if you haven't seen this one, I encourage you to take a look. It's the Atlantic slave trade in 2 minutes, and it's a visualization of every slave ship from Africa to the New World in about 2.5 minutes. The size of the dot is the size of the cargo, i.e. people. And to see the massive flux across this space over this time is to have a visualization of history that often is neglected in our understandings of discrimination. Amr Rahman has this great bit where he talks about reverse racism. He says, I could be a reverse racist if I wanted to. All I would need is a time machine. I would go back in time and I would actively, systemically pull people from Europe into Asia and have them work on rice paddies and create a trans-Asian slave trade, and in the meantime create institutions of power that systematically create these differences. And it's a really great bit, but again, in the interest of time, I won't show it. Maybe we'll close with this one, because it's also one of my favorites. Disparities are real. To the same degree, we're having this conversation now about how different people feel, right? A large percentage of white folks feel that anti-white discrimination is a bigger problem than anti-black discrimination. And I argue that that feeling is counter to statistics, right? And when we get into these feelings, then your feelings are just as valid as someone else's feelings. And if I say I'm offended by something and you say you're not, well then the argument has ended, period. I have an N of 1, you have an N of 1, we have reached a stalemate. So I encourage you to focus on facts over feelings. And I have so many facts. Just in the interest of time, I have so many facts. We can talk about the structural impossibility of the class. We talk about the median income ratio by race, which has not changed over time. We can talk about the disproportionate representation of black folks in stories about poverty and how that impacts our attitudes about people in poverty. We can talk about global women in leadership, gender and technology, gender and journalism. This is a fun one. Not a single outlet in a review from 2007 to 2012, I believe, had more than half of its quotes and articles about reproductive issues for women. Gender and journalism, the disparity in who gets talked about when they go missing. Differences in credibility between male journalists, between bylines and articles that are written by with male names and those that are written with female names. Diversity in music, the difference between who's at the front, who the musicians are, and who's controlling and making the money from the music. Trends in the television industry. Primetime characters by race and gender. Two-thirds of the black women you see in primetime television are in comedies, right? So each of these disparities, I can give you statistic after statistic. The intersectionality of the wage gap, the differences in hate crimes, groups more likely to be killed by law enforcement. Let me know when you get depressed, right? These statistics go on and on and on. And as I said, I'm offended is not a valid argument, right? It's a valid feeling, and you should feel it, and you should understand when other people feel it, but it is not an argument on which to hang our understandings of the world. The one that always gets me is when we talk about the Redskins, right? This idea that, oh, well, you know, I think Redskin is offensive. Well, I guarantee you I can find someone else who identifies as Native American who says it's not offensive. And we have reached an impasse. However, if we're talking about how a football team monetizing a stereotype from a genocide of a people that is the reason that we managed to be here, right? Football. Like that's historically problematic because we are minimizing the impact of genocide. Not because it's offensive, not because it's bothersome. That's my opinion. I'll also say questioning one's belief in the world hurts. Yeah, okay. Questioning one's belief in the world hurts, right? So we are constantly engaging in trying to figure out how to improve our own identities. Positive self-esteem is a psychosocial need, and we will go out of our way to make sure we feel good about ourselves. That is basic bullying psychology. If I make you feel less than, then I'm better. Social comparison, that my value is determined by the extent to which I compare myself to others. So by disparaging out groups, we elevate our in-groups. It's important to note that guilt is not the same as shame. I get real worked up about this. The phrase white guilt is often used to demean and disparage the pain that comes with acknowledging history. Having said that, in psych, we talk about guilt as things that we feel bad about that we can control, right? So if you do wrong by someone, you feel guilty. Shame, alternatively, is the pain we feel for things that we can't control. So you trip and fall, you feel ashamed. You don't feel guilty, right? You didn't actively make a decision for yourself to trip and fall, but you still feel that level of pain. So when we talk about white guilt, I think it's actively used incorrectly. But at the same time, we don't talk about all these other guilts, right? We don't talk about straight guilt. We don't talk about class guilt. Fun fact, class guilt, our entire philanthropic industry is based on a form of class guilt, right? I ask my students, I'm like, why did you give $1 to someone on the street? Oh, well, he didn't have anything to eat. She didn't have anything to eat. I'm like, oh, did you feel guilty that you had something to eat and they didn't? Yes. Then why do we disparage one category or an awareness and pain that comes with one category and not others? This is the one I was talking about from Family Guy. We will have equal rights for all. So as we talk about it, America is founded on principles of diversity established by homogenous groups. We will have equal rights for all, except blacks, Asians, Hispanics, Jews, gays, women, Muslims, anyone who's not a white man. I mean white. So no Italians, no Polish, just people from Ireland, England, Scotland. But only certain parts of Scotland and Ireland. Just full-blooded whites. No, you know what? Not even whites. Nobody gets any rights. Ah, America, right? This idea that by discriminating against other people, somehow we manage to elevate ourselves becomes a snowball effect. And that's it. What's up with that? I'll also make a point to say that we allocate resources, that is to say time, energy, money, to avoiding cognitive dissonance. There's multiple studies, right? The minute you feel that that something you believe doesn't jive with something else you believe, we bend over backwards to make it work so that we don't have to feel that pain. That is the definition of aversive discrimination. And this is a quote from one of my students that I will almost close with. Actually, we'll leave that one out for the time being. But basically, all right, fine. That, taking my class and talking about these things with students is painful to them, explicitly. And I try to remind them that I will make you uncomfortable. This will be painful. And I need you to lean towards that pain, right? Not just avoid it. We are more than amoebas. We are multicellular organisms with free will. Just because something feels unpleasant doesn't mean we have to run away in the opposite direction. And this is a quote from one of my students during my class that said, we've been raised to ignore our privileges, so suddenly getting involved to address them is like entering a juggling championship when the balls are still invisible and you were never taught to juggle, right? That suddenly I'm being asked to see all of these things and I never had to see them before, and that's what we talk through for 80 minutes a day, twice a week, for 15 weeks. I'll leave you with this. Disrupting discourse begins with disrupting oneself. So what does that mean? That means in order to disrupt discourse, in order to change the way we talk about, think about, and live through the world, we have to see these things. Hegemony, right, these patterns of power that exist over time is perpetuated through normalizing issues. In order to disrupt discourse, we have to consider the things we've been actively encouraged not to see. We have to seek. Research why is this an issue? Why is this historically problematic? Familiarize yourself with the history, the language, and the statistics. To come at an argument without all of this research in your pocket is to leave yourself open to somebody undercutting your argument, right? So disrupting discourse is hard. We have to be more prepared. Speak. If you see something, say something in real time and social media. Share content that explains the issues and engage with others. And finally, be accountable. Consider and disrupt your own biases, intentional or unintentional. No one is exempt, and individuals are rarely to blame unless we refuse to see, seek, and speak. So I guess I'll leave you with that. Actually, I'll leave you with that. That's fine. It seems like a good place to stop. I'll make a point to say that you also have a handout that I give in class where, excuse me, not in class, but this is the assignment we do in class, and if anybody wants to continue talking, I'm happy to talk about any of it. But I asked the students to write an email to their immediate supervisors explaining why an artifact is problematic or progressive, right? To actually take the time to connect the history, the statistics, the disparity to explaining what is good or bad about an artifact. Because, the Vogue cover that we started off with went all the way to supermarket shelves in 2006 before anybody said anything, which means one of two things. Either no one at Vogue saw it and didn't know the history, or nobody wanted to say anything. And for my students who are pretty low in the industry hierarchy, I understand that their primary concern is to keep their job, right? So you can't roll up on Anna Wintour if you're an intern at Vogue and be like, Anna, this is racist, right? Like, that's a good way to get fired, right? If Anna Wintour and Annie Leibovitz think this is the best picture they've ever seen, you need to come with a very different argument in explaining, getting them to see something that clearly they don't see. So I guess I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm happy to talk about anything. I'm happy to show videos. I'm not in a rush, but I understand that, real people and real jobs have real commitments. So that's not to say academia isn't a real job.